All right, welcome. This is our first chapter. We will work together here in this online class. Sorry, I'll do that from time to time. We are gathered here in this online class, and normally in these online classes you're kind of left to your own devices, but I like to do a lecture for every single chapter. Now these lectures will feed into your exams, so make sure you're paying attention, make sure you're watching every single lecture I post, and make sure you're taking notes on every single lecture I post. You'll notice these exams that I give you will be about 50% textbook and about 50% lecture. So this is mandatory viewing. It's mandatory viewing. Don't skip out on this. Make sure you're watching, okay? I'm recording this in the summer of 2021. This is June of 2021. So the information I'm giving you is going to be 99.9999 accurate, but it's possible if you're watching this in like 2023 that we have some new things to include. Don't worry about that. I'll include any updates as we see fit. But here I am, I'm recording in the inky blackness that we call the void. And so this is the summer. Instead of being outside and enjoying the sun, I am here achieving a paleness rarely seen. But here I am doing it for you, of course. So let's explore Chapter 1 together. Now, it's called the Democratic Republic. Here it is, right above my head. You have our current president. I doubt anything will happen to him prior to the election of 2024. But here's the White House. And of course, there's Congress down here, right? So this is kind of all the major players. I haven't included the Supreme Court or anything, but these are all kind of the major players of our Democratic Republic. Now, I told you on the welcome video that we start basic at this class. So let's start basic, shall we? For those of you taking notes, which I hope is all of you, I hope all of you are taking notes for this conversation. I'm going to post right now, the very next thing I'm going to show you is the ultimate truism of government. What I'm about to show you is true of all government, no matter where in the world you live, no matter what kind of government you live under, no matter when in human history you've existed. The truism of all government is this, that all government reduces individual freedom and liberty. That is the ultimate truth of all government. Once again, it does not matter what kind of government you live under, it doesn't matter where in the world you are, it doesn't matter when you've lived, all government reduces individual freedom and liberty. Now, the government you live under right now is the American government, the vast, vast majority of you. I know from time to time we have students from other parts of the world, but the vast majority of you are American students in the 21st century living under the American government, okay? So you know that America is free. But let me ask you something. Is America absolutely free? Yes or no? What do you think? The answer to that is no. America is not absolutely free. If America was absolutely free, we'd be essentially living the purge, right? If I really like the hat you're wearing, I can pluck it off your head, put it on my head, and run in the opposite direction as fast as I can, right? Or if I'm making a really, really bad judgment, I can beat people. Like maybe I invite a student outside the building, and I'm like, hey, meet me at 4 o'clock at the tree. And when you show up, I'm there with a baseball bat, and I beat the tar out of whoever it is. Now, in an absolutely free society, I can steal things. I can beat people. I can drink and drive. I can, commit tax fraud, whatever. Okay? I'm not breaking any laws because there is no laws. I'm absolutely free. But of course, that's not the case. We live in a society with rules and regulations that govern essentially everything we do. They govern essentially everything they do, and as a result, I think it goes without saying that they are necessarily a loss of freedom. Now, I can't steal things from you without risking punishment, right? I can't beat people with a bat because I'm risking punishment. I'll very likely be sent to jail for beating the tar out of a student with a bat. right? You can't drink while you drive. You can't commit tax fraud. You can't deface a public monument. I don't know if you've ever taken some time to sit down and think of the millions of things that you can't do because there are laws, rules, regulations that keep you from doing them. I can't fly a plane, even if I want to fly a plane, even if I can fly a plane, I can't fly a plane. You know why? I don't have a pilot license, right? So there are millions of things that you can't do because the government keeps you from doing them. Now, in a way, there's a bit of a drag, right? Because, all these things I wanted to do, I really wanted to beat people with a bat whenever I wanted to. I really wanted to drive a car without a driver's license. Or, I really wanted to, I really want to steal people's stuff. But I can't do that now because the government keeps me from doing it. And again, that's a loss of freedom. But I get stuff in return now, don't I? So I do lose some freedom, but I get stuff in return. For instance, I can't steal your stuff anymore, but I can't have my stuff stolen from me without people risking punishment. So, I get to keep my stuff. I don't have to worry about it so much. Now, I can't steal your stuff, but I think that's a fair trade, right? I can't beat people with a bat, but just, look at me. It's far more likely that somebody will beat me with a bat, and that can't happen either without someone risking punishment. Right? I can't drink while I drive, but I'm very confident the next time I get on the road, very few people, if anybody, will be drinking while they drive. Okay? So you get the idea. We are giving up some freedom to get this other stuff in return, which then begs the question, how much freedom do we really want? How much freedom do we really want? And we talk too reductively about freedom in our society. We often talk about, do you want freedom or do you want no freedom? This person voted this way, they are for freedom. This person voted that way, they are anti-freedom. That's nonsense, okay? Freedom is not binary, where you either have it or you don't have it. You need to think of the scales, okay? What we do is, we put freedom, stand by, we put freedom on scales. So freedom is on one side of the scale. On the other side of the scale is something called order, where we keep our society nice and orderly. Like, people aren't stealing stuff from me, people aren't murdering each other, people aren't beating each other with bats, people aren't driving without driver's licenses. You get the idea. So, to a certain extent, we ask that we put freedom on a scale on the opposite side from order, and it's a trade-off, because think of it this way. You can't have more freedom without losing more order. And you can't have more and more order without losing more and more freedom. Okay? So you get the idea that it's a trade-off. Okay? How far should we go with it? Where on this line do you consider yourself to be? Do you consider yourself to be somewhere here in the middle, wherever that may be? Maybe. Maybe you consider yourself more very few of us are going to be like here at the very end, right? Very few of us are going to be here. But maybe some of us are like here. Okay? Very few of us are going to be here on the order side, but maybe a few of us are here. Okay? Now, wherever you happen to be on this scale, it's liable to change. It's liable to change depending on the subject we're talking about. It's liable to change as you live your life, because I'll tell you right now, as somebody I'm 40 years old, so somebody who's been around the sun as much as I have, I've been all over this scale. Maybe I was here at one point, but I tell you what, I have 2 girls right now, 2 baby girls that are under the age of 7. So right now I'm like right here. Okay? So that'll happen to you too. Maybe you'll evolve differently, but that's how I've evolved. Now I want to know where everybody is at all times. Nobody speak or move. I want to see everybody's hands. Okay? So that's how I have evolved, and I'll continue evolving for the rest of my life. Now, order is not the only thing we weigh against freedom. We also weigh equality against freedom, because if we allow society to be completely free, life is not fair. And so you will see life get unfair in a hurry. So to what extent do we want to promote equality, fairness? To what extent do we want to do that? Well, the more equality, let me get down here, the more equality you promote, the less freedom you have. And the more freedom you have, the less equality you're promoting. Now, sometimes that can be like racial equality. Like if I run a bakery, but I happen to be really racist against, name it. I happen to be really racist against Jewish people. and it's time for me to hire some new employees, and so I put a sign out front that says, now hiring, Jewish people need not apply. If I do that, if I put that sign out front, are we as a society comfortable with that? Now, we have passed laws over the last century saying that we are not okay with that. So even though it is my bakery that I am running and I am making money off of it and I own it, we as a society have said, no, you don't have that freedom to discriminate against people of different races or genders or disabilities or ages. You get the idea, all right? So we have said that. But equality also, equality and freedom is also a financial consideration, because we have some people in our society that are not very well-to-do. We have some people languishing in poverty, and as a result, we as a society have agreed to have certain programs, such as welfare, where tax dollars come from some of us to provide for the people who are really struggling. Are you okay losing some, here we are. Are you okay with losing some of your financial freedom to promote equality for the people who are struggling? And I think most of us are okay with, like, I'll just as a disclaimer, you can tax me if it means kids aren't starving in the street, right? That is a degree of freedom I am willing to give up. I'm willing to give up some of my paycheck if it means that the kids in my community, and really every community, aren't starving in the streets. Like, that's how I feel. Maybe you feel differently, or an alteration of that or something like that, so be it. But regardless, that is an example of where I may fall on this particular scale, okay? So as we get closer and closer to freedom, we're getting further, I did that again. As we're getting closer and closer to freedom, we're getting further and further from equality. As we get closer and closer to equality, we're getting further and further from freedom. So how much freedom do we want? There's no correct answer to that. It's just something that we as a society debate and argue about all the time. So where do you want to put those lines, guys? Up here, you want to put it here and then here, or here and then here? Like, you know, where are you comfortable putting those lines? Well, figuring out where you want to put those lines, that's what politics is. That's all it is. Really, all of American society is just trying to figure out how we want to balance on those two different scales. Matter of fact, all of American politics really breaks down to two questions. All of American politics is two questions. The first question is, what resources does the government need? And usually we're talking about tax dollars there. What taxes does the government need? What funding, what resources does the government need to operate? Second of all, now that the government has collected those resources, what do we want the government to do with them? Okay? Hey, American politics can get very complicated. It can get very complicated in a hurry. But no matter how complicated it gets, all the political discussions boil down to at least one of these two questions, sometimes both of those questions, okay? What do you want the government to do, and what resources does the government need to do those things? That is a society-wide debate that we are constantly having. Now, for the record, may I blow your mind? May I take a moment to blow your mind? Are you ready? I know we've only been having this conversation for like 8 minutes, but are you ready to have your mind blown? Let's do it. Now, when it comes to these two questions that you're looking at right now, we tend to disagree on the answers. Did I blow your mind just now? Willing to bet I didn't blow your mind, because you're alive, you're on social media, you know that people disagree when it comes to politics all the time. This is not new news to you. Okay, you know people disagree. So let's break down the reasons why people tend to disagree politically. First of all, they may tend to disagree because they have different political preferences. They have different preferences. Like, for instance, maybe you're pro-life, maybe I'm pro-choice when it comes to the topic of abortion. Maybe you're pro-life and I'm pro-choice. Now, you and I may be fighting like cats and dogs because you believe the government should use its resources to prevent abortions from occurring. I believe that the government, and in this hypothetical, I may believe that the government should use its resources to ensure that women can seek abortions when they want. So you and I are disagreeing like cats and dogs on this subject because we have different preferences. Now, it's also possible that you and I politically disagree even though we have the same preference, because we have different intensities of preferences. Now in this hypothetical, we'll say you and I are both pro-life. And yet I am a pro-lifer in this hypothetical who is arguing that I want the government to ban abortions, and I think the government should prioritize it so much that it should shut down all other functions of the government until we ensure no abortions occur. So that is my hypothetical political pro-life stance. You may be pro-life and you're like, hold on, I don't like abortion any more than you do. But the government can multitask. We don't need to shut everything down to ban abortions. And so now you and I are fighting like cats and dogs, even though we're on the same side of the issue, because we have different intensities of preferences. Now, another reason why you and I might disagree is because we have personal gain on the issue. Like maybe I'm really wealthy and therefore I don't want taxes to go up. I want taxes to go down. But maybe you are impoverished and you would benefit from like an expansion of food stamps because you're hungry, and that would involve my taxes going up. And so you and I are arguing because we have differences in personal gain from how this particular policy may play out. So there's any number of reasons why we might disagree with each other. I don't think any of these three blow your mind. The problem is, is that we have 30 million people in America, and 330 million people have 330 million different ideas as to how they want the government to operate. Remember that sliding scale I showed you a moment ago? People have 330 million ways they want to see freedom balancing out against those other things. So, how do we settle disagreement? Well, this is where different countries have different answers. Okay? Now, if you live in a dictatorship, it doesn't matter if you and I disagree, because our opinions don't matter. The only opinion that matters is the dictators. But in America, we do disagree all the time, and we attempt to settle that disagreement with democracy. Okay? That's where our conversation begins. We have democracy because we need to settle disagreements in our society. Okay? Now, make sure you know that democracy comes in different flavors. Make sure you know different kinds of democracy. Okay, there's any number that we can cover, but let's cover the two basic formats of democracy. The first is called direct democracy. It is in textbooks only, sometimes called participatory, but I'm telling you right now, I don't care about participatory. You can just... Can I find that? Where is that? Yeah, you can kill that. I don't care about that. Forget it. I only include it there to be completist, okay? I will never ask you to know the phrase participatory democracy. I don't know why textbooks do that. But direct democracy, you do need to know, because direct democracy is when we simply do what the majority of the people want. Yes. Who wants to build a wall at the southern border? Yes. No. Well, if more people vote yes, then we'll build a wall on the southern border. That's direct democracy at work. Now, direct democracy can take several forms. The most common, at least here in Missouri, is something called an initiative. Okay, that's called an initiative. Now, an initiative is when the people themselves get an issue on the ballot for you and I to vote. So the people get the issue on the ballot, and then the people vote on the issue once it's on the ballot. That's called an initiative. Okay? Now, I'll just be clear with you. When it comes to direct democracy in general, but initiatives specifically, there is no direct democracy and there is no initiative at the federal government level. So the president, Congress, the Supreme Court, none of that is direct democracy. We'll talk about that later. But we do have the initiatives, we do have those in Missouri on the state level. Many states have initiatives. And what happens is a bunch of Missourians run around with petitions. If they get enough signatures in enough places, it ends up on the ballot, and then Missourians can vote on the issue. They can vote it up, they can vote it down. The most recent thing we voted for here in Missouri, we voted to expand Medicaid, which is health insurance for people in poverty. Government health insurance for people in poverty. We voted to expand that. A bunch of people got it on a petition, they added it to the ballot, and then we, the people, voted on it. So the key phrase that you're looking at there is publicly voted on. If we publicly vote on it and it gets done, that's called an initiative. Contrast that from something called a referendum. Now, a referendum, once again, is something that ends up on the ballot for you and I to vote on. So that is something that ends up on the ballot. Now, a referendum, however, is put there by the legislature. It's put there by Missouri's Congress. In Missouri, we call our Congress the General Assembly. It's confusing, but we'll get to it later this semester. But an initiative is when we gather a petition and it ends up on the ballot. But a referendum is when the General Assembly just kicks something over to the people for them to vote on. Key phrase, publicly voted on, right? Publicly voted on. Once we vote, it theoretically will get done. That's called direct democracy. Also, maybe you've heard of recalls. These are not common, but they do happen. Recall votes. Maybe you've seen the show Parks and Recreation. In season 3 or 4, Leslie Knope faces a recall. Okay, and a recall election is whenever somebody who's a public official is facing a vote to potentially remove them from office. But you'll notice all 3 of these phrases have the same phrase: publicly voted on, publicly voted on, publicly voted on. All 3 of these terms have the same thing: public votes, and then it gets done. That's direct democracy. Now, the opposite of direct democracy, at least as far as democracies are concerned, is known as indirect democracy, which, by the way, is sometimes called representative democracy. It is sometimes called representative, so that is a word you should know. But indirect democracy, you and I are no longer voting directly on stuff. Instead, we are electing somebody who will go off to Washington, D.C., or go off to Jeff City, or go off to the city council here on Chestnut Expressway here in Springfield, Missouri. Anyways, once we send them off, they will go and vote on our behalf as our representative. Now, as you can imagine, the federal government, when it comes to the president and Congress, there is no direct democracy with the federal government. But the federal government is all indirect democracy, right? We don't vote on whether there's a wall on the southern border. We leave that up to Congress to do. And if we like the job our congressperson is doing, we can re-elect them when they're up for re-election. Or we can fire them and replace them with, whoever's running against them, right? Let me ask you a question, though. A question that people who don't take this class often flunk. And that question is, what makes a democracy a democracy? Let's talk about that right now. What makes a democracy a democracy? Too many people that haven't taken this class will say, voting, people vote, and it gets done. That's what makes a democracy a democracy. But guys, that is not so. That is not, just because you're voting doesn't make a democracy. Lots of dictatorships allow for elections, and surprise, surprise, the dictator gets like 95% of the vote. Okay, this just happened in Syria a couple weeks back. Syria, the country of Syria in the Middle East, has essentially a dictator right now, and he just won 95% of the vote. So voting does not make you a democracy, folks. Voting does not make you a democracy. These things do, though. Thing number 1, what we call universal suffrage. Everybody gets the chance to participate. Okay? Suffrage, by the way, is a word that means voting. I know it sounds like you're in pain. It sounds like suffering. But suffrage is a word that means you get to vote. And a democracy allows for universal participation. Now, when we say universal, though, we don't mean truly universal, right? Like people who are in prison don't get to vote. Immigrants in America don't get to vote. If you are a child, you don't get to vote, right? My 6-year-old does not get to vote. So when we say universal suffrage, we mean roughly like as universal as reasonable. Another thing that makes a democracy is what we call majority rule. What's the point of having a vote between yays and nays if the yays get more votes, but the nays win the day? That was a hiccup there. But the yays get more votes, but the nays win the day. The whole point of having a democracy is having the majority steer the country in the direction it needs to go. And so majority rules is a really important aspect of a democracy. Now, on top of that, you also need something called political equality, where everybody's vote counts the same. It doesn't make any sense for my vote to count as 2 and your vote to count as 1. Or for your vote to get heavier and heavier as you get older, right? Or for votes in certain states to count more than votes in other states. That's what we call political equality, or equality. Okay? All three of these are critical aspects of what makes a democracy democracy. And you know what? I don't know how many people are watching this video right now, but I am willing to bet that if I were to poll you guys, almost all of you, if not all of you, would agree with all three of these aspects. I'm willing to bet we almost all agree that our democracy should have universal suffrage with political equality and majority should rule. I'm willing to bet most of us feel that way. And yet, we argue about them all the time, because despite the fact we may agree on the principles, it's when you come down to the specifics where we start arguing about it. Like, for instance, just to give you a general example, some people a couple years ago were talking about 16-year-olds should have the right to vote. 16 and 17-year-olds, because the voting age, as you probably know, is 18. If that's the case, 16 and 17-year-olds, should they have the right to vote? We're talking about universal suffrage, shouldn't they? Well, maybe. You know, obviously we agree there should be universal suffrage, but now we can have ourselves an intense debate over whether that means 16 and 17-year-olds should be allowed to vote. Now, for the record, how easy should it be to vote? There have been a rash of what we call voter ID laws. You'll learn about that more in Chapter 5, that have been passed throughout America, including in Missouri. Now, if you show up to vote, you have to have a photo ID. That is a recent development. You have never needed that prior to just a few years ago. There are some populations, particularly urban populations, that it's common for people not to have IDs. So have we made it unduly difficult for some people to vote? With an ID, maybe, maybe not, right? On top of that, what about the Electoral College? Something we'll learn about in Chapter 8. The Electoral College is how we elect the president, and the Electoral College ends up making some states more important than others, and on top of that, it does make it possible, for those of you that remember 2016, it does make it possible for some people to win fewer votes and yet still win the presidency. That happened in 2016 and, for the record, in 2000 as well. How is that possible? We'll talk about it later, and maybe as a result the Electoral College has a tinge of anti-democracy to it. I don't know, maybe that's something we can explore later. On top of that, what about felons? If you have gone to prison and served your time, you are released back into society to kind of make a new life for yourself. Should you also get your right to vote back? In most parts of the country, the answer to that is no. You do not get your right to vote back. You certainly don't get it in Missouri. Unless, of course, you're like pardoned or something like that by the governor or by the president. We'll talk about that stuff later. But should felons get the right to vote back once they've paid their, imprisonment debt to society? Maybe, maybe not. That's not there's no correct answer there. We can also talk about immigrants. Immigrants don't get the right to vote, and yet they have just as much at stake in America as the rest of us, but we do not allow them the right to vote unless they get naturalized and earn their citizenship, right? So anyways, I'm just bringing this up as a way to say that even though we agree on the general principles, we still do disagree on how the specifics of those principles should be applied. That does bring us, by the way, to what I think is the most important conversation of Chapter 1. And that is the conversation over how American democracy actually works. Did you guys hear that? My stomach just rumbled. I got that live on the lecture. I hope you heard that. But anyways, I can tell I'm recording during lunchtime. Anyways, how does our democracy work? How does American democracy actually work? Now, it's really important for us to explore this because this is a widely misunderstood part of American democracy. Literally, the gears of how it actually works. Now, the conversation over how our democracy actually works, there are different theories as to how it works, and the theory we grew up with in grade school is called the majoritarian model. It's called, once again, it's called the majoritarian model. And the majoritarian model says the government ought to do, let me point to that, the government ought to do what the majority of Americans want. One more time, the government ought to do as the majority of Americans want. Once again, if the government says something like, should the government provide health insurance for everybody? Yes, no. If the yeses get more votes than the noes, well then the government should absolutely do that. That's the majoritarian model. Now this is the version of democracy we all grew up on. This is whenever we say government by the people. Whether you know it or not, you're talking about the majoritarian model. If I ever ask anybody in the hallway, how do you think American democracy works? Most people say, well, the people vote and the government acts accordingly, to continue earning their votes. They're talking about the majoritarian model, whether they know it or not. I don't blame you for understanding American democracy as the majoritarian model. It is easy, it's intuitive, it's simple to understand, it's beautiful in a way. The problem is the majoritarian model is not a very accurate way of understanding how American democracy actually works. It's not a very accurate way of understanding it. And that's because the majoritarian model makes some assumptions about who we are as a population that are problematic at best, flat out wrong at worst. And we'll break that down later. But first, let's just explore the assumptions the majoritarian model is making about us here. Okay? Let's explore the assumptions the majoritarian model is making. So once again, the majoritarian model is saying that the government is doing this. The government's putting its hand to its ear and saying, tell me, America, what would you like us to do? We the people say, do this. And the government's like, sir, yes, sir. And off it goes. Now this assumes several things. The first thing it assumes is that we are proactive participants in our democracy, that we the people are itching to make our voices heard. Just give me an election, government. The first chance I get to vote and make my voice heard, I will show up. We the people will show up in droves to make our voices heard. Now, in addition to that, it also assumes that we, the people, are well informed, which makes a ton of sense if you believe in this model. Because if you think the government's sitting there, listening, taking directions from us, as if we, the people, are really steering the ship here, it makes sense to assume that we know how to steer the ship, right? So we, the people, are well informed, and we're sitting there saying, oh, it's a good thing, American government, that you've asked us whether the government should insure everyone. It's a good thing you've asked us that, because we spent a lot of time going over the specifics and the details and breaking down the pluses and minuses of the government insuring everyone. Now, another assumption being made here about the government is that it rolls out the red carpet for us to vote. If the government is doing this, it must be making it easy for us to voice what we want it to do. It must be easy to vote. It must be, the access must be easy and free. Now, needless to say, in ways we'll break down in a moment, these are all assumptions that are not super accurate. And as a result, the majoritarian model, not that accurate of a model. Rather we kind of think of it as a classic model. It's archaic. It's outdated. I don't know if American democracy ever worked like this, but it certainly doesn't work like it now. Anyways, when we're asking the question, how does American democracy actually work? The answer we grew up with was the majoritarian model. Here's what it is. Here are the assumptions it's making, which are not so great, which is why we think of it as an archaic, outdated model of American democracy. Now that does upset the apple cart a little bit here, because again, you have learned about the majoritarian model in grade school, in high school. Some of you may have learned about it well after high school. It's the version of democracy that's the easiest for us to recognize, but it's not super accurate. So if it's not super accurate, what is the most accurate way of thinking about American democracy? Well, allow me to introduce you to the notion of the pluralist model. Now, the pluralist model is a different model of American democracy. And you know what? I will break down for you what it means. Let's put up the definition in a moment. But first, let's actually work backwards on the pluralist model. Let's start with the assumptions. Let's start here with assumptions. Okay? Now, the pluralist model rejects the assumptions that the majoritarian model makes. Are we, for instance, am I saying that right? For instant or for instance? I bet it's instance. Anyways, for instance, are we proactive participants in our democracy? Do we vote in droves? Not really. We do vote in droves if it's a presidential election. But presidential elections are only once every 4 years. But we have massive major national elections every other year, called midterm elections. We'll talk about those more in Chapter 8. Those barely get 45% turnout from the American people, even though the control of Congress hangs in the balance of them. We don't show up for an election unless the president's on the ballot. I haven't even gotten to like state-level elections, the primaries for which are held in August. I haven't even talked about local elections, which are held every April. Guys, you have local elections every April for city council and school board, and sometimes tax levies. That ends up on the ballot every April, and Springfield at least doesn't show up for these. 10% turnout is the average. 10% turnout for local elections here in Springfield. 9 out of 10 Springfieldians say, nah, I'm good. Or most of them don't even know there's an election in April. There is, 100% there is an election coming up every single April for local elections. Springfieldians simply don't show up. And that's the way most of America is. Are we proactive voters? Not really. Not really. On top of that, do we all have free and easy access to voting? Not necessarily. Like, it is free to vote. And it depends where you vote. Where have you voted? Most of the students in this class are probably in the Ozarks, and voting in the Ozarks is pretty easy. You show up, probably don't have to wait in that long of a line unless it's a presidential election. Probably doesn't take you more than 15 minutes. Usually it takes you 5 minutes. When I vote in a local election, it takes me exactly the amount of time it takes me to walk in and walk out, because there is no line for local elections. But it's a lot different if you voted in a big city. Have you ever voted in a big city before? I voted in Kansas City once, back in 2004. That's how old I am. Anyways, when I voted back in 2004, I waited in line for an hour. And it gets even worse the bigger your city is, because you roughly have the same number of polling locations, but now you have people, millions of people living on top of each other. And that's why every single one of these presidential elections, we always hear horror stories out of New York, out of Philadelphia, about people waiting in line for 4 hours, 5 hours, ridiculously long waiting times so they can cast a vote. That's ridiculous. And that's not super easy to vote. Why don't they fix that? Also, guys, when do we vote? We always vote on what day of the week? A Tuesday. Always a Tuesday, which is a work day or a school day. That's not super convenient. Now, a lot of us have to work our jobs. We can't just leave our jobs to go vote. Now, there are laws that say that your employer has to allow you to go vote. But if you need 4 or 5 hours on your shift to work and earn a living for your family, you can't easily leave. Not for 4 or 5 hours, not if you're in one of those big cities. So that's a major sacrifice. And so for most of us, the best chance we have to vote is on our lunch break, okay? And if you're asking me to choose between democracy and a sandwich wins every time. I'm hungry now, right? So it's not as easy as it could be. So maybe we can move that Tuesday election to Saturday. Can't we do that? Maybe, maybe not. That doesn't solve the problem for a lot of you. A lot of you work on Saturday, right? So tell you what. Why don't we do what some other countries do and have an election holiday? Because all these people who serve in office, they're like, the most important thing you can do is vote. You got to vote, you got to vote, you got to vote. Okay, well, all right. If you want us to vote so much, give us the day off so we can go vote. Okay? So I wake up whenever I want, go to the park, eat a sandwich, go cast a vote when I have some time to do it on election day. But we don't have that here in America, so it's not as easy as it could be to vote here in America. In some places, it's downright hard to do so. Now, on top of that, On top of that, are we well informed? The pluralist model says no. And the pluralist model doesn't say that. American polling says that. It says Americans are not super well informed on the issues. And it's not because Americans are dumb or anything. It's because Americans are busy and they have lives, and most of us are really, really smart on 5 things on the earth, right? We're really smart. We are the person you want to talk to for 5 things. Everything else, you're just kind of a common dumb person, right? I think, just me personally, I think I know political science pretty well. I think I know it pretty well. But I don't know the first thing about how my car works. I'm straight up dummy when it comes to my car. And that's the way we are in life. We know a few things pretty well. Everything else, we're just kind of a common dumb person. And for a lot of people, one of those issues that people are just lay people and they don't know a ton is, in fact, what the government does, politics, government, all that good stuff. So the pluralist model, 2 key assumptions. It rejects these assumptions from the majoritarian model. Now, the third assumption being made by the pluralist model is really important. It seems out of left field, but guys, this is where the rubber hits the road, so stay with me, okay? The third assumption being made by the pluralist model is that people tend to group up with people who are like themselves and then organize politically. Now, this is not a political theory, it's psychology, it's behavioral psychology. We tend to gravitate to people who are like us. Okay? Think about your friends. Your friends are probably they're probably your age. They're probably your income level. Okay? I'm probably friends with more 40-year-old men than you are. Okay? I'm probably friends with more white people than the average non-white student that might be watching this right now. Now, I really hope that I'm friends with men more than the average woman is going to be. I hope that I'm not sexist, however. And I'm likely to be friends with the average Caucasian more than the average non-Caucasian who might be watching this. I hope I'm not exhibiting prejudice when I do that, but we the people, psychology says we tend to gravitate towards people who are like us. So you're probably not, if you're a teenager, you're probably not friends with very many 40-year-olds, right? If you are rich, you're probably not friends with many poor people. If you're poor, you're likely not friends with many rich people. If you're a Christian, you're like myself. You tend to be friends with more Christians than the average non-Christian may be. Anyways, that's just demographics, right? That's just demographics. We tend to gravitate towards people who are like us. There's nothing sinister in that necessarily. Now, it can bear prejudice, of course, but there's nothing sinister in that necessarily. It makes sense to gravitate towards people who share a lot of worldviews with yourself, who shares a lot of similar experiences. Like most of my friends tend to be 40-year-old guys with kids. That's the way my life goes. Now that in mind, that's not just your demographics, it's also your political beliefs. So if I'm like a hardcore environmentalist, how many lumberjacks am I going to be spending my time with? Right? Probably not that many. Right? If I'm a vegan, I'll probably gravitate towards other vegans. If I am a gun rights enthusiast, I'll probably hang out with other NRA members. You get the idea? So we tend to gravitate towards people who are like ourselves, and over time we will organize into groups called interest groups. And those interest groups will try to influence the government. Guys, that's what the pluralist model is saying. The pluralist model says that these groups, thousands of them, will all organize and try to influence the government for their preferred causes. That's what the pluralist model is saying. All these interest groups of different groups of Americans will fight each other to influence the government. Because guys, going back to the majoritarian model, the government is doing this. The government has its hand to its ear every day. Okay? This is really happening. The government is saying, all right, America, tell me what you want me to do. But we the people don't really vote. And so we're kind of whispering our answer rather than saying it out loud from like the opposite side of the room. We're also not that well informed. So our whispered answers are kind of garbled nonsense that don't make a lot of sense to the government. So if the government's saying, tell me, what do you want me to do? We the people tend to be whispering garbled nonsense from the opposite side of the room. But these interest groups tend to be very engaged. We'll learn about them more in Chapter 7. They tend to be very engaged. They tend to be very well informed. And they tend to make themselves very loud for the government. So while the government's doing this, tell me what you want. We the people, whispering nonsense from the opposite side of the room. Meanwhile, interest groups are right in the ear of the government saying, do this! And the government's like, oh, I guess the people have spoken. Right? And so, since the majoritarian model is saying government by the people, really the pluralist model is saying it's government by competing interest groups. And this is a far more accurate understanding of how American democracy actually works. Because like I said, we the people are not that engaged and not that informed. But interest groups are hyper-engaged and they're hyper-informed. And as I said, we'll return to them in Chapter 7 to learn about them some more. So the pluralist model is a more accurate understanding of how American democracy actually works compared to the majoritarian model, which is not that super accurate. There is another model out there that I will include, and that is elite theory. Elite theory argues that democracy is a sham, and that instead of we the people, or even we the interest group people, driving the ship or steering the ship. What do you do with a ship? I think you just steer it. But anyways, instead of steering the ship, it's really just a small group of rich guys who are steering the ship for us. And they are doing it not to benefit America, but to benefit themselves. Elite theory. Now, I don't know how much you buy into elite theory. I know a lot of people believe that America is not run by the people at all. Instead, it's just run by the rich and powerful. And if that is your point of view, then perhaps you subscribe to elite theory. Now, with that in mind, there is a $5 word. Do you know this word? This word that actually describes elite theory. It starts with an O. Have you ever heard the word oligarchy before? Oligarchy? Archy? Let me see if I can point to it. Archy, there it is. Archy means rule by, and olig means few, rule by few. So oligarchy is just kind of a fancy way of saying elite theory. Okay. I won't ask you to know oligarchy for this class. I will ask you to know elite theory. I will not ask you to know oligarchy. But in case you ever hear that on the news or in political conversations, now you know what it means. It means that democracy is a sham. Everything's being run by a small number of rich people. Okay. Now, we just had ourselves a good, big, fat conversation about democracy. Democracy is not the only option out there in society, in the world. Matter of fact, on the planet Earth, more people live under non-democracies than democracies. So let's take some time to familiarize ourselves with a few non-democratic options that tend to be very prevalent across the world. Now, the most oppressive of these is something called totalitarian. And it's got a great name, totalitarian. And totalitarian is a type of non-democracy where the government controls your entire life. Okay, it doesn't only control your political life, it also controls your culture, it controls your social life, it controls your religion or lack of religion. That's called totalitarian. Now, I probably am not blowing your mind when I tell you that the biggest example of a totalitarian, or the best known example of a totalitarian regime in the world is North Korea, right? Because in North Korea, they control like every part of your life. They control the media you consume, the shows you watch, the books you read. They control your religion. You know, you can't be Christian in North Korea. You have to subscribe to some sort of like, you idolize the Kim Jong whatever as a god. Real world's not very fun, though. What is a lot more fun is the fictional world. And in the fictional world, there are lots of totalitarian examples. If you've ever read the classic novel 1984, 1984 is about a totalitarian regime. You need to remember that because people, when they get upset about politics, talk about 1984 a lot. And they're like, can you believe Donald Trump or Joe Biden did this or that? It's like 1984. Well, kindly remind them that they have not read 1984 if they think that's the case. Because in 1984, the government tortures people in the Ministry of Love. That's nothing, even Biden or Trump on their worst days is nothing like 1984. Now, on top of that, maybe you haven't read a classic novel, but you have seen a very popular movie series called The Hunger Games. Hunger Games is absolutely a totalitarian regime. Maybe you've read a more recent assignment for classic totalitarian reading, such as The Giver. The Giver is absolutely a totalitarian regime where they take certain people in society and release them. No spoilers. No spoilers. No spoilers. Anyways, that is what a totalitarian regime is. Make sure you know the difference between a totalitarian regime, however. Oh, I forgot to mention *Handmaid's Tale*. If you're watching this on Hulu, you shouldn't be. It's depressing, but it's really, really super good though. But yeah, that's the Gilead, the fictional empire of Gilead, is absolutely a totalitarian regime. All right, so let's keep on going with non-democracies, such as authoritarianism. Make sure you know the difference between totalitarian, which is where the government controls all aspects of your life, and authoritarianism. Now, authoritarianism, the government doesn't control all aspects of your life, it just controls your political life. So the government is run by usually a ruler, like a dictator or a king or a queen for that matter. They're run by a ruler. But you can still have your own businesses. You can still have your own religion. You can still have your own culture, right? Like you could have, this is usually a dictatorship, often a monarchy. But these dictatorships are sometimes called autocracies. You do not need to know the phrase autocracy. But if you ever hear the phrase, like Joe Biden talked about this recently, he was talking about autocrats across the world. Well, autocracy means rule by one. So rule by a single person, so usually a dictator. Now the real world example, the clearest real world example of an authoritarian regime would be Russia, right? Russia is absolutely an authoritarian regime. You don't need to know these examples, but if it helps you, so be it. But Russia is ruled by one guy, Vladimir Putin. He runs Russia. But you can still have your own religion in Russia. You might be oppressed but you can still, Russia is known for having a raging counterculture that runs counter to the many things that Putin himself believes in. That's because you have no democratic rights in Russia. But you can have your own life, your own religion, your own business. Just don't run afoul of the government, I suppose. Anyways, the interesting thing about authoritarian regimes is that they're often lionized and celebrated in pop culture, in fiction. Like, for instance, I don't know if you've ever read Lord of the Rings or watched the movies. If you ever watched the Lord of the Rings movies, a lot of those Lord of the Rings kings are celebrated as like benevolent guys, like Theoden here, of the Kingdom of Rohan. They are celebrated. Theoden, by the way, not elected. There's no election chapter in Lord of the Rings, right? Or the Bible, for that matter. There's no elections happening in the Bible. On top of that, have you seen any Disney movie ever? If you've seen any Disney movie whatsoever, you'll know that every Disney movie has some sort of king or queen in it. And again, none of these kings or queens are getting elected, right? They are all kings probably because their parents were kings, right? And yet many of them are celebrated as good guys, right? Of course, that's not always the case in fiction. There's Game of Thrones, where a bunch of your kings are jerks. This guy is a jerk. You need to chill out. But anyways, regardless, that is the difference between a totalitarian regime and authoritarian regime. Let's go over a couple more examples of non-democracies, but before we do that, I just want to make sure we draw our line in the sand. What is it that makes it a democracy versus a non-democracy? This right here is your line in the sand. Your line in the sand is that anytime the laws that govern us are not being determined by popular will, well, then it's not a democracy. Okay? If here in America, generally speaking, our politics kind of goes in the direction of popular will, we are a democracy. But in these countries, they're just going to go however the dictator wants it to. It's not being determined by popular will. Other examples of non-popular will include theocracy. This is where you're being governed by a religion. Okay, for instance, the Vatican. The Vatican in Italy is its own little city country, and all three branches of government are the Pope. The Pope is all three branches of government. Now, this can be democratic, like if your country votes, we should just do what the Bible tells us to do. Like if your country decides to do that, it's a democratic theocracy. But nonetheless, If decisions in your society are not being made by the popular will, but instead being made by the religion or the religious institutions in your country, then that's a theocracy. We just got done talking about oligarchy, so I'll just mention that one more time to be completist. Here's a couple other synonyms for oligarchy. Have you ever heard the word plutocracy? Probably not. But plutocracy is another fancy way of saying small group of rich guys running everything. You've probably heard of the word aristocracy before. All three of these words largely mean the same thing. It means small group of rich people. Okay? Now, we also, and here's an example. Now, we also have very common, we have many non-democracies within America because Native American tribes, there's not very good PowerPointing there, but Native American tribes have elderhoods where their tribe is run by the elders. Now, elders are not democratically elected, by and large. For the most part, you age into the role, because that culture reveres the opinions of the oldest, which, you know, it should. The elderly people, at least older people in our society, tend to be, you know, have a lot of life wisdom. Anyways, this tends to be very common, and by the way, very popular among the tribes that exercise elderhoods. All right, so that brings us to the end of our conversation of democracy versus non-democracy. I will say for a moment, though, that I do wonder sometimes what the heck is going on in Black Panther. Have you ever seen the movie Black Panther? Clearly it's not a democracy, because in order to be king, you got to have people beat each other's brains out on the side of a waterfall. But maybe it's an elderhood because the elders decide who it is that fights on the side of the waterfall, even though the only people that ever get a chance to fight have to have royal blood, like M'Baku or Killmonger. They're the only people that get the chance to challenge on the waterfall. I gotta be honest with you, I have no idea. I have no idea, really. I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know who it is. I don't know what kind of democracy or non-democracy is going on in Black Panther. All I know is it's like my favorite movie. Now, it's time for us to have an elongated conversation here, guys, because Chapter 1 contains a 1 to 2 page discussion about something called ideology. And I feel like we should talk about it more extensively. So let me take the last 20 minutes, 20, 25, maybe 30 minutes or so, and talk about political ideology, because it deserves a longer conversation than a half hour that your textbook dedicates. It's just not enough time to learn about something this important. So let's talk about ideology. Starting with, what is it? Okay, we should talk about ideology because it controls our political conversations. And ideology, put simply, textbook has a fine definition, it's fine. But put simply, your political ideology is your political philosophy. Let me ask you a question right now. What do you think the government should do for the people here in America? Okay, now I don't know how many people are listening to this. We'll say per class, I got about 25 students per class, probably 25 different opinions as to what exactly the government should be doing for its people. Whatever your argument is, assuming you have one, I know some of you might not have one because you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff and you're kind of new to it, so be it. But if you've spent time thinking about it and you have an opinion over what the government should be doing, well then you have an ideology, okay? You have a belief system. You have a personal philosophy as to what the government should do. Okay? Now, so the question following up from that is, how slavish are you to that ideology? How committed are you to it? Do you ever violate it? Do you ever stray from it? Maybe you're what we call ideological, and that means that you will always buy what your ideology is selling. Maybe you're conservative. That's a type of ideology. Maybe you are liberal. That's a type of ideology. Maybe you're socialist or communist. We'll talk about that stuff here in a few. That means those are your ideologies. And if that's the case, you always believe that your ideology is the right answer all the time for every question. Compare and contrast that to being more pragmatic. Pragmatic means that you usually think your ideology is the right answer, but you're comfortable in straying from it from time to time. Maybe you have kind of a mixture of beliefs. You know, you're more conservative on some issues, you're more liberal on others. Or maybe you're just more willing to compromise and stray if it means bringing more people along to your point of view. You know, even if it means sacrificing 25% of what you want to get 75% of what you want. right? So that's called being more pragmatic. And we saw this in the Democratic presidential primaries. Joe Biden, before he ran against Donald Trump, had to win the nomination for the Democratic Party. It's something we'll talk about more in Chapter 8. But he ran primarily against Bernie Sanders, who's very ideological. But Joe Biden himself, very pragmatic, and most Democratic voters tend to decide with the pragmatism over the ideological demands of a Bernie Sanders type candidate. Anyway, so let's talk about those things. Before we get into that, and before we talk about liberal versus conservative, which is a conversation we need to have, because like I said, it really drives the political conversation and the political actions of America. We need to talk about the economic system of America, because that's really what pushes these political beliefs on one another. And the economic system we have in America is called capitalism. Now, there's a definition for capitalism. I'll put it up here, but there's really just one critical part that I need you to know. Kind of, let's see if I can get a little lower here. Anyways, the textbook definition is that it's an economic system characterized by the private ownership of wealth-creating assets, free markets, and freedom of contract. So I'll give you a moment to jot that down, then we'll break it down together what exactly we're talking about here. But I'm telling you right now, that first part, the private ownership of wealth-creating assets, that's the most important part. I'll give you just a moment on that. All right. So with that in mind, what is capitalism? This is a nice little definition, but what is capitalism? Okay, what makes capitalism capitalism? Right here, what makes capitalism is this key phrase: private ownership of wealth-creating assets. Let's break that down. What are wealth-creating assets? Well, that's just a fancy economic way of saying businesses, because businesses create wealth. That's why they hire us and pay us, okay? So if you don't know what that phrase means, wealth-creating assets, just substitute it in your mind, businesses. It means businesses. Now, what we're saying with capitalism is that businesses in a capitalist system, such as in America, are privately owned. Now, when something is owned privately, who doesn't own it? The government, right? Because if the government owns something, it's public ownership. We collectively own it. That's why it's called a public park. If you ever go to a public park, that's something that we, the people, own collectively through the government. But if it's privately owned, that means people own it, individuals own it, or a company owns it, okay? And so that's really what we're saying here. Capitalism is saying that businesses are owned by individuals. And if there is one word to define capitalism, it's this one: competition. These private businesses will compete with one another for customers. If you happen to live in a neighborhood that has a cul-de-sac and there's a person on that cul-de-sac selling tomatoes and a tomato stand, and you walk by and they yell at you, "Hey, come buy my tomatoes, they're fantastic." And you walk up and you buy a bushel of tomatoes for however much it costs to grow them, plus a little extra for profit. You're engaging in a transaction, but then you'll notice a few days later there will be another tomato stand set up across the street. Okay? These tomato stands are competing with one another. They're owned not by the government, they're owned by individuals who are trying to beat each other and swallow up all that sweet, sweet tomato money for themselves. Okay? What we have just created is a capitalist market, a free market. Okay? And they are competing. Now, in this competition, the government has a role, and the role of the government is as a referee. The government is regulating. It's regulating businesses, not controlling them. It's regulating businesses, not controlling them. And that means if you own your business, you can run your business however you want, but you have to stay in bounds. And the government sets up the boundaries. For instance, you can't have like children you don't know working for free in your field. You have to pay them, okay? And they have to be of working age. You can't stuff cocaine into your tomatoes, okay? Probably be good for repeat customers. No, wouldn't be good for private health. or wouldn't be good for public health is what I'm trying to say. So if it turns out that like I'm earning all this money, but I'm not paying taxes on any of it, well, then I get in trouble again, right? So the government doesn't tell me what to do. It's not controlling me, but it is saying like you have to follow these general guidelines. You have to follow these rules, okay? So there are, regulations. Now, on top of that, the whole reason we have this capitalist system is for something called the invisible hand of the market. And the invisible hand of the market is arguing. The invisible hand of the market is arguing that through this competition, actually, let me get out of the way here. Through this competition, products will get better. Because businesses are trying to beat each other. I don't care about Adam Smith, but I need you to know about this right here. The quality of goods and services will get better. And prices will stay reasonable. Like if my tomato stand is competing against your tomato stand, you're going to have to churn out good tomatoes or I'm going to run you out of business. And you can't jack the prices up too much because I'll undercut you and steal your business. Tomatoes is kind of a silly example because tomatoes can't get that great. But what about this? And it's not easy to see because everything in here is black. But what about this? It used to be that your phone was like the phone, just attached to the wall. None of you remember that. People my age remember that. And at a cord, you could only go so far from the wall. Over time, they were like, what if we add a little antenna to the phone and now we can walk around anywhere in the home? And then over time, they turned it into cell phones so you can walk around anywhere in society. And then they turned cell phones into smartphones, into tiny computers you carry. Why do we do that? Why did phone companies invent the smartphone? Was it because they were like, what would be best for America is if we had smartphones and everybody benefited from it? No, of course not. That's not what they were thinking. What they were thinking was we need to invent the best phone possible and run the other phones out of business. That's the free market at work. Now, you could argue over whether phones are reasonably priced, but nonetheless, that's what we're going for here. Now, we talk about capitalism all the time because we live in America. America is a capitalist society. What we are absolutely not is a communist society. Let's get to know communism for a hot second. What's communism? Well, as you could probably anticipate the definition here, it's when there's public ownership of wealth-creating assets. There's public ownership of wealth-creating assets. Public ownership of wealth-creating assets. Now that means your businesses, your wealth-creating assets, which are businesses, they are now controlled by the government. Okay, so there's no more of this private businesses competing with one another. It is government-mandated cooperation. Okay, so now there's no more tomato companies competing with each other. It's a government-run tomato industry. It's a government-run tomato industry. The government's not regulating you anymore. It is now controlling what you do. You can only sell tomatoes a certain way. You have to grow them a certain way. You can only charge so much. Here's what you have to do with the money you make. The government's absolutely controlling. It's not just merely regulating you anymore. Now it's very aggressive, which means it's going to have to be very powerful. If you have a government that's strong enough to dictate how all industries have to operate, not just regulating, like they have their hand on the steering wheel of all industry, then you're going to need a very powerful government. And to be honest with you, this is kind of where it falls apart for communist governments, because really powerful governments with this much power have a bad track record of oppressing its people. I mean, I'm not here cheerleading for capitalism. Capitalism does not deserve a halo or anything, but at the end of the day, capitalist societies far outpace communist societies in human rights, in civil rights, in personal freedoms. Because when you give the government that much power, you end up kind of running into a problem there. And guys, I just want to remind you that we live in America, and that means we live in a capitalist society. And so I'm going to set up a capitalist umbrella here. Let me see if I can create it. I don't always do a very good job. Let me try one more time. There we go. Oh no, one more time. There we go. So we live in America, which means we live in a capitalist system. Now, we argue about how capitalism should operate. We argue, stand by. There we go. We argue over how capitalism should operate, and the argument tends to be between liberals and conservatives. Please understand, can I put my hand down now? I'm going to do that. So please understand, when we talk about liberals and conservatives, the argument they're having for all their differences is how should capitalism operate? That is the argument that liberalism and conservatism are having. They are both under the umbrella of capitalism. Now, let's get into liberal versus conservatism, and because my PowerPoint starts with liberalism, let's talk about it. Liberalism advocates for positive government action to improve the welfare of individuals. There's also some stuff up here about supporting civil rights, and tolerating political and social change, but really the most key part is that first part. It advocates for a proactive government action to improve the welfare of individuals. One more time, advocating for positive government action to improve the welfare of individuals. How well aware are you of liberalism? Are you more, there's another word for it is progressivism. If you ever hear somebody say I'm progressive, that's another way for someone to say I'm liberal. But how familiar are you with liberalism and progressivism? Do you consider yourself liberal and progressive? Maybe you don't consider yourself that. And maybe you hate liberalism and progressivism, okay? Regardless of how you feel about liberalism, a third of Americans describe themselves as liberal or progressive. And that's because it's reasonable. It is based on an indisputable truth. And even if you hate liberalism, you cannot deny the indisputable truth of it, which is that we live in a capitalist society, and in a capitalist society, some people end up getting left behind, or some people end up falling through the cracks. Capitalism is essentially a competition. That means you'll have some winners, and that means you'll have some people who struggle. Okay? You can't have a competition where everybody wins. So here in American society, you'll have a small number of people who will do amazing. The rest of us will do fine. The rest of us will do okay. A good number of us will struggle a little bit. Some of us will struggle quite a bit. And then you're going to have a fair percentage of people who will just economically get their tail kicked. It's not even really their fault necessarily, but they're in poverty. I'm not saying it's tough for them to make rent. I'm saying they're homeless. I'm saying they're starving. I'm saying they're unemployed. Okay? I'm saying that you get the idea. They're really on the bottom economic rung of the ladder. And there's no way to avoid this in a capitalist society. Again, you can't have a society where everybody wins. So if that's the case, liberalism says we should set up a net under society known as the social safety net. And if people fall through the cracks, they'll land in this net. They'll land in this net. Now, what should go into the net? Well, we could debate that. Liberals themselves debate it all the time. What should go into the net? How generous should the net be? Right now, we have examples like welfare, WIC for women, infants, and children. We have Medicaid, which is health insurance, government health insurance for the elderly, for the poor. We have Medicare, which is health insurance for the elderly. We have Social Security. We have food stamps. We have Section D housing. Many of you are taking this class on Pell Grants. Pell Grants is a form of social safety net. So this is what liberalism is suggesting. Now with that in mind, this net costs money. So how are we paying for it? Well, we're going to pay for it with tax dollars, but not the tax dollars of the people in the net for the most part. It's going to come from roughly everybody else, which is called redistribution of wealth. We tax some people in society to provide for others. Those taxes will provide for others to help them make ends meet. I mean, if you're on welfare, you're not dining on caviar on a yacht, okay? But we're hoping you can make ends meet. Again, this is just the idea that the government should be doing more things to help more people. You should generally have the government regulating businesses more, argue liberals. Generally speaking, remember that at the beginning of this conversation we had our spectrum between equality on, let's see, that'll be, is this your left? It should be equality on your left hold on, let me see which one's, this is my right, this is your left. So we'll say your left. Sorry if I'm getting this wrong. I hope I'm getting it right. But you have equality on the left, you have freedom on the right, and generally speaking, these two guys are on a scale. And if you ask liberals, generally, which way do you kind of prefer to go on any given issue, generally speaking, they're going to tilt towards the equality end of the spectrum. Generally speaking, that's what they're going to do. That doesn't mean liberals are anti-freedom. That is ridiculous nonsense. I hate that stuff. But yes, they generally prefer equality. Now, the political party most aligned with liberalism in America is the Democratic Party. There they are, the Democratic Party. You'll get to know them a little more thoroughly in chapters like 9, 10, 11. You'll get to know them a little more thoroughly in chapter 7 especially. But just for now, the Democratic Party is your more liberal political party. For some reason, they are represented by a donkey. Now, liberalism, perfectly reasonable point of view. However, it is not bulletproof. There are problems with liberalism. The first of those problems is that it costs more. If you have a government doing more things for more people, it's going to cost more money. Generally speaking, you're going to have higher taxes. The Biden administration has been trying to raise taxes, primarily on corporations and the wealthy, but nonetheless they've been trying to raise taxes. And you'll see that with more liberal, progressive regimes. On top of that, you can also argue that social safety net meant to provide for the people who are struggling. Unfortunately, several of us know horror stories about people who, instead of using the social safety net as kind of like a circus net to catch you, they instead use it as a hammock to kind of just depend on the government. And so some people have argued that liberalism undermines self-reliance. Now, another criticism of liberalism is that it might have too much faith in the government's ability to solve problems. After all, liberals usually argue that there is public policy that can solve this issue or that issue. And is that always the solution? More government involvement across the board on more things? You could argue that maybe liberals have too much faith in the government's ability to solve problems. That's liberalism in a nutshell. As you can see, not perfect, but it is a reasonable point of view. You can see why a third of Americans subscribe to it. Let's get to know conservatism. It's important to know conservatism because a third of Americans call themselves conservative. A third of Americans call themselves conservative. And they do so because it is a reasonable ideology. Conservatism is reasonable. But anyways, obviously there's other parts about traditional values and a cautious response to change, but nonetheless, the key part of conservatism is this first part. It believes in a limited role for the government. A limited role, particularly for the national government. A limited role in the national government. How well do you know conservatism? Maybe you know conservatism, you consider yourself conservative, you like it, okay? Maybe you know conservatism pretty well and you are not a fan of conservatism. But either way, a third of Americans call themselves conservatives because it's reasonable. Like liberalism, it is based on an indisputable truth. And we'll just pretend that didn't happen. We'll pretend that I'm not here hawking loogies at the window. Anyways, conservatism is based on an indisputable truth. And that indisputable truth is that whenever you empower the government, you are risking giving it too much power. Okay, we see this with communism. If you empower the government to extreme degrees, the government will run roughshod over you. It can become oppressive and suppressive. And so if that's the case, why even tangle with that bear? You know what we should do, so say conservatives? We should bench the government whenever possible and really let the free market push society forward. The free market's not perfect. It's going to create problems as well. but at least you're ensuring individual freedom. So goes the argument of conservatism. And I don't want to be reductive, but generally speaking, conservatism is about less. Not no government, just less. There should be less social welfare, less of a social safety net, less redistribution of wealth, less government regulation, less. Okay, so it's kind of the shortcut explanation there of what conservatism is. Now that brings us back to the scales, right? You had equality on one side and freedom on the other. Generally speaking, liberalism preferred to tilt towards the equality end of the scale, and conservatism will tend to trend towards the freedom end of the scale. Now that doesn't mean conservatives hate equality. That is silly nonsense. Silly nonsense. I hate it when people talk like that. But so in policy making, we have to make decisions, and liberals will tend to lean towards the equality end, and they'll make priorities of pro-equality measures, and conservatives tend to make priorities of pro-freedom measures. Do you know the political party that is more conservative? Perhaps you do. It is the Republican Party. The Republican Party, there they are. I do want to let you know, by the way, just as a quick little aside here, as an aside, some people get confused by the name Democratic Party and Republican Party. Don't be. Those are just team names. That doesn't mean anything, okay? They're just team names. They might as well be called like the Heat and the Warriors. It might as well be called that. But anyways, the Democratic Party tends to be more progressive, tends to be more liberal, and the Republican Party here tends to be more conservative. Conservatism. Reasonable. Is a reasonable point of view. You can see why a third of Americans, including much of the Ozarks, where we live, tends to be conservative. Now, with that in mind, there are problems with conservatism we should familiarize ourselves with, just like there was with liberalism. Now, first of all, conservatism just has less to offer you if you are one of the truly unfortunate in society. If you're one of the truly unfortunate people that are really struggling to get by, conservatism does not make it a priority to offer you services that will help you make ends meet, whereas liberalism will. On top of that, we just got done clowning on liberals for having too much faith in the government's ability to solve problems. We can do the same with conservatism. Only conservatives may not have enough faith in the government in solving problems. We have too much faith in the private market, in businesses, to solve problems. You know, we don't need to put halos over the government, but certainly private businesses don't deserve halos either. The private market doesn't deserve a halo. Capitalism does not deserve a halo. Okay, it can solve problems for us, but again, with conservatives, is the private market always the answer? Is the free market always the answer? Less government always the answer? On top of that, because conservatism puts such an emphasis on pro-freedom measures, it has lacked in fighting for some civil rights. Not because conservatives are sexist or racist necessarily, or for that matter, homophobic, but it is, you know, when you're fighting for greater civil rights, you're fighting for greater equality, which means the pro-freedom oriented of us who tend to be more conservative might be more resistant to that kind of stuff. 2/3 of Americans consider themselves liberal and conservative, and as a result, most of our conversation is dominated by what these two political points of view have to say, these two political ideologies. But there are other ideologies worth considering, even though these are not nearly as popular as liberals and conservatives. Let's take a quick run through of each. We'll start with libertarians. Libertarianism looks at much of that conversation we just had with conservatives, where we're talking about less, and libertarians will say, that's an interesting, that's interesting. How about instead of less, we go with almost no? Can we do that? We almost no. And so they are very skeptical of the government. They really want to reduce government to like a skeletal function. Libertarians have been involved in debates over whether we should have driver's licenses, whether we should require seatbelts, whether, you know, I'm just trying to give you, I don't know why I'm gravitating towards car-related examples, but nonetheless, they really believe in like really reducing the government down to its base form, really enable some trade, offer us a military, and then that's it. There is, you don't need to know this, but there is, you need to know what libertarianism is, but there is a libertarian political party. You don't need to know that, but it's there. They have their own presidential candidates. That's Joe Jorgensen, who ran for president back in 2020. Came in a distant third. But she is not even the best known libertarian we have in America. The best known libertarian politician is probably Rand Paul, who's actually a Republican. But he's a Republican who considers himself ideologically libertarian, and he represents the great state of Kentucky. Libertarianism. So, for the record, we can create this little, let me see if I can create this here. We can create this spectrum here, okay? On one side, you have equality. And on the other side, you have freedom. Okay? And this is the middle, wherever that happens to be. Now, liberalism is going to tend to favor equality. So this is liberalism right here. Whereas conservatism is going to tend towards freedom. So this is conservatism right there. Okay? Now, libertarianism, very skeptical of the stuff the government does. So libertarians tend to be, and I don't know where you want to put these dots, but obviously libertarians are going to trend a lot more libertarianism towards the freedom end of the scale. Okay? Now, over here is socialism. And socialism favors strong support for equality, even to the point where certain industries may require, to ensure equality, may require government takeovers of the industry. You hear this a lot with socialists when it comes to like health insurance. We shouldn't have private health insurance, says some socialists. Instead, we should have the government eliminate private health insurance and just provide health insurance to everybody. That's a government takeover of an industry. And if that sounds like communism, it is a cousin of communism. Socialism really has a leg in communism, just like it has a leg in capitalism. It's really kind of the first time we're drifting out from under the umbrella of capitalism. All right, now again, you need to know socialism, but you don't need to know that socialism has several prominent political parties. Most well known is the Green Party. They run their own presidential candidates. Here's Howie Hawkins, did very poorly, a distant fourth place in 2020. But of course, the most famous socialist in America is probably Bernie Sanders, right? Anyways, that is our breakdown. Oh, I forgot to mention environmentalism. There you go. That's environmentalism. But regardless, that is our breakdown of chapter 1. Obviously, this is a big, long conversation. No other chapters, I don't think, will have a conversation this long. It's just really important that we have a good basic understanding of democracy, how our government works, and of course, non-democracies and these different political beliefs that people can end up having with one another. So I hope that this was useful. If you have any questions, you're always free to email me, and I will see you guys at the next lecture. Thank you.